Dreaming big. I thought after I did the 8 o'clock service of something that happened here where some people dreamed big. Some of you may not be aware that my predecessor, Edric Corbin Banks, and a couple of parishioners from St Peter's, a couple of other lay people from other churches in Katikati had a dream. The dream was to start a Christian school, and that Christian school was supposed to be up Woodlands Road. They had some land they were going to purchase, and at the last minute it all seemed to turn a bit sour, but it was part of God's plan because God had a bigger picture. Well, that dream of a Christian school grew that it became Bethlehem College today. That's where it started. It started here in Katikati with the idea of a Christian school. A guy called Marty Heslop, I think it was, Edric and some from the Christian Centre had this dream and it was fulfilled. But could you imagine starting off with just a primary school or a small school up Woodlands Road to look at Bethlehem College today? What a dream. So that's our theme today, to dream big. And there are two things I want to share with you basically from the Old Testament reading this morning. It's a wonderful story. It's a story that if you read your Bibles well, or if you're into drama and acting out things, Joseph in his Technicolor Dreamcoat, you'll know the story really, really well. But the first point about this story, it's a story about hope. But a hope scattered amongst youthful arrogance. Even though the hope is short-lived until 23 odd years later. The second point for us as listeners, especially, is that of us seeing the suffering servant. This is a person who accepts injustice, imprisonment, without any complaining, but only because of one reason. He was sure that he had divine aid on his side. In other words, God had given him the vision. God was his hope. And in the first 4 verses of our reading today, it introduces us to the story of Joseph, a story that has been portrayed through drama for many years. But the story does start with hope. It says, this is the story of the family of Jacob. Jacob being the person of hope. Because if you know the prophecies of Jacob and what God had promised him, then this was the continuation of that hope. And one of the first things we learn is that Joseph was a bit of a telltale. Although there is nothing in here to indicate what Joseph said or whether it was even correct, the Hebrew translation could easily mean that he went round telling lies, or evil whispering, or what we might call today as unfounded gossip. While the next verse may explain a little about Joseph's behaviour, and it's a painful verse to read. The verse says, Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than his other sons. Now, this morning, Bob read out that the sons of Ishmael and who was the other wife as concubines. Now, Joseph was born of his wife, who couldn't have children to start off with, Rebecca. And so that's why, one of the reasons why Joseph was special. Now, Jacob, now called Israel, favoured Joseph, and so he gave him a gift, a garment, a coat or a tunic. The point here is not the coat or how it was made, but that this gift was given to one of his 13 children, but the youngest. It is typical sibling behaviour to think a parent likes one child better than another. But Jacob proves his preference with a gift. Now, right at this point, you could say that Joseph was set against his brothers by their father's gift, or by their father full stop. And what this does is that it places Joseph in a position that makes him higher in the pecking order than the eldest son. It's dramatised by the drama groups with the long sleeves and the fancy frills and all the jewellery that's attached to it. And basically, whatever translation it says, it basically means that Joseph no longer has to do the menial tasks, such as looking after the animals. and that he now is even entitled to his own servants, chasing after him. And you can see why his brothers, especially the eldest, because Joseph had now taken his position in the family before his time. And of course, the whole family were upset by what Jacob did. He was barely 17 years old, and he should have been learning the role of a son, which is carrying out some of the menial tasks to prepare him for adulthood, especially as a man of his time and culture. For him to learn about how to care for the stock or the farm was vital for the family's future. Yet his higher appointment put him in a very awkward place. And it was an awkward situation in which Joseph became isolated and even endangered by the hostility of his brothers. And yet it was not necessarily of his own making. And there was little that he could do to put things right. Now, in this section omitted from today's reading, Joseph tells his brothers of two dreams. One of them is where they will bow down to him. And of course, the brothers interpret Joseph's dream as further evidence of his youthful arrogance. And then he had a second dream, and he said that even his father would bow down to him, and his father rebukes him for it. So Joseph, get my tongue around it, Joseph is not innocent when it comes to his relationships with his brothers. He appears to be taking full advantage of his favoured status. Now, as parents, we would have said that Joseph was acting too big for his boots, too big for his britches. And while he may be the favourite, he doesn't need to rub it into the faces of his brothers. And so the first point the writer is trying to make here is to show us that this young, boastful, arrogant lad is just that, young and arrogant. Yet there is hope because God is with him. Our story then continues into the rest of the text for today. Jacob's sons were tending the herds. Jacob sent Joseph to check them out. And you should note that this is not the first time that he's checked out on his brothers, because the first time he checked them out, he gave his dad a negative report. I don't know what they were doing. Maybe they were slacking on the job. But he told his dad what they were doing or what they weren't doing. So when they saw him coming, they said, "Let's kill him. Let's throw him into a pit." Until Dad, he was killed by wild animals. Now, were they serious at this point or not? Because I've heard people say, or family members say, out of frustration, "I'm going to kill you." I come from a family of 7, and I probably had it said to me, and I probably said it to some of my brothers and sisters as well, but I didn't mean it. Now, I'm not justifying what they did. We only know by what we hear. Because until the brothers act on their anger, they're acting just like any ordinary other family members would do. But anyway, Reuben, the oldest, steps up to dampen down their anger. And he suggests, let's throw him into the well instead, into the pit or the dry well instead, with the idea that he would come back later and pull him out of the well. But as we know, the whole thing goes pear-shaped, because the brothers sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites instead. And Reuben went back to save Joseph and was grief-stricken over his brother's rash act. And of course, there's no response from the other brothers to cover their crime. In fact, they never ever, until later, express remorse. But we all know families can be difficult. And it's rare that a family where there is not estrangement of some kind, physical or emotional harm, also happens more than we'd like to acknowledge. You only need to hear some of the stories that our Seasons grief program helpers come across. Even Reuben, who did his best to act correctly, was thwarted. How often have we tried to fix a situation only to make it worse? And so this estrangement is really one-sided. All of the brothers look at each other through the eyes of hurt and anger. Joseph may not see his actions as one of the reasons for his brother's contempt, but these brothers only see their father's favouritism. and their younger brother's youthful boasting, all made worse because Joseph thinks of himself as better than they are. And from a bird-eye perspective, we can see the conflicts causing the problems. And so this leads us on to the second point of the story. And that's where the writer is preparing us to know and to understand about the noble Joseph of all the stories that come next. And part of that knowing is us seeing the suffering servant, a person who accepts all this injustice, even imprisonment, without complaining, all in the sure faith that he has divine aid on his side. This is God's will, he said, for me to suffer. In my daily reading, I'm a little bit above or ahead of where you guys are. I read a chapter of the Old Testament and the New Testament every day, and it's I don't know if it's coincidental that I seem to be just a little bit ahead of all the readings as they come up. But I've just finished reading the story where he interprets the king's dreams, and now his brothers are on their way to Egypt to meet with him for the third time, where he breaks down in tears because he tries to hide who he is, because they thought he was dead as well. But anyway, what's the story telling us in regard to the suffering servant? Well, I believe the story is encouraging to those of us who've had a bad start in life, or perhaps a slow start. In fact, there are many people whose life doesn't start well, whether it's to a poor upbringing or to favouritism in a family situation. I still hear stories of adults blaming their parents for the position they are in now. We read about in the paper, I was brought up with a violent father. I was brought up with an alcoholic mother or whatever, and that's why I behave like I do. We hear it all the time, don't we? But this story shows us how we respond to our past can make our future. But it also informs us of what can happen when we start to act on our anger, as the brothers had done. Relationships can fester and even break down altogether. See, we need to remember that anger is an emotion, and it's okay as long as one doesn't act on it. And then in coming back to the story, everyone in life has had at some point a dream for their life. And today there are 4 things that we should not give up on about the dreams that have been shown to us. The first one is that we shouldn't give up on our dream, though it may not have started well. It didn't start well for Joseph. At 17, Joseph dreamed that one day his family would bow down to him. But he made the mistake of sharing that information with them in a bad way, and it got him into a lot of trouble. But it didn't stop him. The beginning of the dream often generates more enthusiasm than wisdom, and so we can say and do things we shouldn't. But Joseph encourages us to recapture the dream that maybe we've abandoned. The second thing is that we're not to give up on our dream even though others don't support it. Joseph's brothers said, "Look, this dreamer is coming. Let's now throw him into the well or kill him," they said. And so it's hard to keep our dream alive when others are trying to kill it. Whether that is our brothers or our sisters or our mum or our dad, or maybe even members of our church. Many, many years ago, in the year somewhere in the 1880s, some people of Anglican backgrounds decided they wanted church on the hill. It took 4 years for that to be accomplished. And then they still had to wait 4 or 5 months to get in because they didn't have the last £100. We've got a great church history. Many years ago, David Crispin had a vision to start the Seasons program. And in those days, when they were first starting it, we would have had to pay the headquarters, I think it was something like $21,000 or $25,000 a year to have that privilege. And everyone said, no, we can't afford the $25,000. So it got put on the shelf. But he didn't give up the dream or the vision that God gave him. 5 years later, we started the Seasons program. And what a difference it's made in people's lives. And there are probably other stories too. If you want to read this church history, some books out there. Grab one, take it home. If you want to make a donation for it, by all means, but otherwise just take one home and read about the dreamers of St. Peter's. And so when our dream comes from God, it holds us, even if we're unable to hold it, because timing is the important part. And knowing God's timing isn't always easy, especially if you're impatient like me. Thirdly, don't give up on our dream, though our journey is full of surprises. Our dream will invite negative feedback from others at times, but don't let that discourage us. Opposition can be a sign of respect. It means you haven't been defeated. 5 times we read, the Lord was with Joseph, and he'll be with us too. And then lastly, don't give up on our dream, though it takes a lifetime to fulfill. How many years was it before Joseph's dream was fulfilled? Anyone guess?